Okay, I think we're ready to roll. Well, lovely to see folks, or at least see you virtually, or hear you virtually, or know you're there virtually. And welcome to our Next of our Curious events. I'm Jeremy Smith. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I'm here to chair today's event. It's one of our Curious 23 operations, as you will know, and it's a whole series of talks which are both virtual and in the Royal Society of Edinburgh's buildings in Edinburgh. Today is going to be a great talk, I know, because I know of Donna's work, and I think she's pretty fantastic. She's going to give a talk about one of those languages of Scotland which sometimes gets a bit occluded, which is Norse, and what Norse does and where Norse is, or how Norse culture impinges on the nation. So really, all I need to do is just introduce our speaker today, Donna Heddle. And Donna is the head of the Research Environment and Culture at the University of Highlands and Islands, and a mover and shaker in that institution. She directs also the university's Institute for Northern Studies. And I had a little look at, well, I know a bit of Donna's work already, but I had a quick glance down her current pages on these matters, and she's all over. I don't know, she's all over the place, but she's extremely vigorously active in a whole range of areas to do with Scottish cultural formation, ranging from Scottish and Northern, indeed Arctic language and literature, which I think is exciting, cultural tourism, but also a lot of the historical background and all those areas where the history and the present day interact and talk to each other. She has a personal share from the university. She was the acting vice principal in 2021-22, and she's currently a trustee of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and of Sir Sean Connery's Scottish International Education Trust, and she works for the RSC and Northwest Advisory Board. Well, I'm going to shut up talking now. So I will disappear into the ether, but I'll be lurking still, keeping an eye on the Q&A. So I'm going to hand on now to Donna, who is going to address us all. I should flag that Donna said to me she has a slight cold, but I know she's a trooper, and well, that won't deter her. If she suddenly falls silent, she will wave at me, and I will pop up and say something. Okay, so that's great. Lovely to have you with us, Donna, and thank you so much for giving today's talk.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's not often I'm described as being all over the place and a trooper in the same sentence, but I'll take that. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to have so many of you join me tonight to talk about one of my favourite subjects. I'd like to thank the Royal Society of Edinburgh for asking me along for this talk. And what I'm going to try to do is we gallop breathlessly through quite a lot of history and information in the next 40 minutes or so, pausing only to grab our deer stalkers of detection as we investigate the facts and come up with some conclusions. I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about the Norse in Scotland. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the myths that prevail about them, but mainly I'm going to talk about place names. Hopefully I'm going to surprise you with some information about place names that you didn't know. And then I'm going to take three, I suppose, main elements of place names and tell you a little bit about them and how they, we will go on tour around Scotland and we'll have a look at those. And I'm very much indebted to the late Professor Bill Nicolaisen for these lovely maps. I love a map myself, and Bill did some wonderful ones to do with place names. So I'm very delighted to be able to use them tonight because Bill was one of our first lecturers when we first started our courses at the University of the Highlands and Islands and was very supportive there. So the Norse then, they're woven right through the tapestry or the tartan of Scottish history and culture, and it's time this is recognised. I mean, why do we not know more about them? Why do we assume they were raiders who came in the night on long ships with horned helmets to rape and pillage while under the influence of hallucinogenic substances and then left? Why are the Norse so much a part of the story of Orkney and Shetland and Caithness and not anywhere else in Scotland? Why does most of Scotland see the Norse as ephemeral invaders and not part of our history and story? Well, one of the reasons is there's no single name for the Norse occupation of Scotland, unlike the Danelaw in England, despite the longevity of the Norse seats of power. And this may be because there are very little contemporaneous historical accounts, and we're forced to rely on just a handful of rather biased texts, including Orkneyinga Saga, which is a work combining fact and fiction. A work of faction might be the best way of describing it. Another factor is timing. Having lost power and influence early on in the development of the Kingdom of Scotland, they've historically been seen as other to this country. Norse power in Scotland had waned before the Kingdom of Scotland fully took shape, and the main figures in the story of Scotland come from Pictish and Gaelic Scot, not Norse. You know, the big heroes of Scottish history are the Southwest boys like Bruce and Wallace, for example. The Norse areas of greatest influence, such as Orkney, do not map onto modern centres of population in Scotland either. So they're marginalised in every sense, I'm afraid. Dundee is not a Norse place name at all. Urwilly is not a Norseman. So I'm now going to share my screen and start my presentation. So the picture here, of course, in the front, in the first screen, is up Hillia in Shetland, and Shetland and Orkney, as I said, have a very strong Norse identity, along with Caithness on the mainland. Now, one of the great problems that we have is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, people started to search for origin myths after the two great events of the 18th century, which were the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. The fabric of society was completely changed. And later on, people started to search for their own origin stories. And there were two main origin stories, the Celtic and the Norse, if you like. And Scotland chose the Celtic, the Fenian myths, and so on. And England chose the Norse or the Anglo-Saxon myth. And for example, Tolkien uses this to great effect in Lord of the Rings. For him, in many ways, the real heroes of that are the Riders of Rohan, who are the Anglo-Saxons. But we didn't choose that. So they're marginalised there in that sense. The other problem they have is they sometimes don't seem to have a voice of their own. And I'll come back to that in a minute when I talk about Norn. Other people interpret their story. They are the victims of a politicised, exocentric discourse founded on the writings of people like Adam of Bremen, who was writing around about 1070, which creates a huge campaign of otherness. Adam's scary foreign beast of medieval times, their reinvention as the noble warrior of Victorian times, their subversion in National Socialist iconography in the 20th century, all are fictions with a political agenda. And this includes the fundamental origin myth choice of most of Scotland, including Lewis. And I'm going to come back to that because it might surprise you to know, drum roll, that nearly all of the place names in Lewis are Norse. They just don't look like it. And I'll explain that a bit later. The Northern Isles have always identified themselves with that other prevalent 19th century origin myth, that of the Norse. But the truth is that as settlers and traders, not as raiders, they left a permanent imprint in our legal system and our language. Their influence is also in our names. If there's anybody out there called Lachlan, the Norseman here, or MacLeod, son of Leot, Macaulay, son of Olaf, MacSween, son of Swain. And then there are the place names. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But I want to say a little bit too about the Norse themselves. Northman, that is the name that they most often called themselves. Viking is an activity. It is not a name of a people. You go Viking. You go into the fjords. So Viking is pirating, if you like. They called themselves Northmen. What did other people call them? Vikings, Viking to the Anglo-Saxons, Askomani, the Ashmen to the Germans. This is quite interesting too, because quite often they used an ash as a mast for their boats too, but actually in this case it refers to the hawk-like foreign policy, if you like, of doing damage everywhere. Loch Lanach to the Gaels, which gives us the name Lachlan that I was just referring to, the men of the Lochs. Bina, as well, for the Anglo-Saxons also use that term. Rus or Ross, which is also used, which gives us the modern place name Russia, Belarus, and so on. And this may come from the term for rowing. It may come from a place name, but nonetheless, that's what they were called. And also Varangian, meaning the sworn men. The Varangian Guard were the guard of the emperor at Constantinople, point of fact. And one Harold Hardrada, whom some of you may have heard of, spent 20 years as the chief of the Varangian Guard in Constantinople before deciding to come home to Norway, kill his nephew, and become king of Norway. It's certainly an approach to promotion, that's all I can say. So, other problems we have are the horned helmet issue. This is not a Viking helmet. This is a Bronze Age ceremonial helmet. In the 19th century, people thought that the actual Viking helmet, which looked something like this, was a bit too boring, so they transferred the horned helmets, the horns from that helmet onto this helmet. Now, let me tell you, no Norseman worth his salt would have worn a horned helmet for fighting. They fought very close hand-to-hand combat on board boats and so on. And in the parlance of Blue Peter, they would have easily had an eye out if they tried that. So if you take nothing away from this talk tonight, ladies and gentlemen, please remember the Vikings did not wear horned helmets. We have never found one. Other myths, of course, include the fact that they were going to drink out of the skulls of their enemy. This is not something that happened either, and I often wonder if that's been confused with the toast skull into that one as well. So what was the actual truth? I should also say too that for those of you who are fondly imagining that a burial for a Viking includes a burning ship, I'm afraid that's entirely wrong as well. My husband, who is very much of Viking stock, his family came in the first boat from Telemark to Orkney, built a boat, and I said to him, when you die, my love, do you want me to push you off at Scapa and set fire to you? I'm based in Orkney, I should point out. And he said, do not be foolish, woman, that would be the waste of a good boat. And I'm afraid that would have been the Viking view of that as well. So I'm sorry if your illusions are shattered there, but let's talk about the facts very briefly before we get onto the place names, which is the meat of the matter. So we can see here in this map, and I do love a map, the Viking homelands there, A, B, and C. So you're looking at Norway, Denmark, and Sweden there, and you're looking at the movements that they went. Now, most people assume that the Vikings went to the west, and I'm using the term Vikings here because the Viking expansion is a recognised term. And indeed they did, and you can see the places that they went. Orkney and Shetland, the Faroes, that's I, J is Iceland, K is Greenland, and L is what we fondly hope is Vinland. But you can also see that they go D into England, they go E into Europe there, right round into the Mediterranean, down the main rivers of Europe as well. So it's an extensive expansion, fueled mainly by the desire for glory and for profit. Let's not forget. The story of the Vikings expansion usually cites the behaviour of Harold Fairhair in uniting all of Norway and becoming extremely undemocratic. But in point of fact, it's really got an awful lot to do with people looking for profit. And of course, going on a Viking trip gave you great glory. So let's have a look at this in a wee bit more detail. There we are. So you can see when they actually got to various places. So they get to Scotland pretty early on, actually, in the story. They get to Scotland in the 8th century. And the famous quote from the Fury of the Northman, good Lord, deliver us, I'm afraid probably referred to Vikings from Orkney and Shetland rather than Vikings coming straight from Scandinavia, I'm afraid. But you can see that in 1854, for example, they got to Novgorod, and Novgorod, once there was the breakup of the Soviet Union, restored the Viking galley proudly to their coat of arms there. We also see Kiev there, and Kievan Rus, of course, was the great kingdom there. And it does amuse me with Vladimir Putin's expansionist ideas, if you like, that Russia was in fact, more likely to be part of Kievan Rus than the other way around. Slight exaggeration, but not that much. And if you look right at the bottom there, you can see Miklagard, which is Constantinople. I love the Norse understated way of naming places. Miklagard, the big enclosure, the big place. Great stuff, boys. Well, that absolutely does what it says on the tin, and we'll see that in a minute when we start to look at the place names in a bit more detail. So you can see that it's an incremental but steady movement there. I also draw your attention to Normandy, which you can see in the north of France there. And Normandy was actually settled by quite a few Norse from Orkney as well. Hrolf, who was the great grandfather of William the Conqueror, was actually the son of the Earl of Orkney. So I'd just like to put a wee posit down here for the fact that in 1066 you have the Orkney conquest and not the Norman conquest. I'm not serious, of course, but it would be nice to think that we could change history a little bit. So I think you're getting a sense there of where they went. And the fact that navigation and travel was incredibly important to them. And that's actually incredibly important to the place names as well. The place names tell us about what kind of settlements they were, but they also use navigation and identification of places as being particularly important as well. And they travelled using Viking boats. And I can't let this talk pass without saying one or two things about Viking boats. There you are, one of the finest pieces of engineering of the medieval period, with a draft sometimes as low as 50 centimetres. There we are. You can just see a little bit design there. Now this looks very familiar to us in Orkney and Shetland, and indeed in the Western Isles, the shape of the boats pointed at both ends, the Orkney Eels, the Shetland Eels, for example. And it is obviously a very powerful symbol today, because that is the symbol of the Council of the Western Isles, and that is the flag of Lewis. So the means by which they travelled is equally as important as the place names that they left behind in many ways. But my Viking boats lecture must wait for another day, for we're here to talk about place names. So I said that they didn't speak for themselves, and this is true. Their story was written down by other people in other places in other times. What they did use was runes, and we can see here some examples of Yellingstone, for example, and some examples of runic inscriptions. And I've chosen this particular one because although we don't have a lot of writing that they did themselves contemporaneously, inscriptions do tell us a lot. And this is a particularly good one. King Haraldr ordered this monument made in memory of Gormr, his father, and memory of Thurvi, his mother. That Haraldr who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. Well, he's got it all going on in this inscription, ladies and gentlemen, because he's in memory of his father, but also his mother, which is quite important. And it's going to lead me on to a rediscovery that I'll share with you later on in the talk. But Harold, who is, you know, a valiant Viking and has won all of Denmark and Norway, but is also a Christian, and has made that. Sorry, I'm seeing a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Is that better? Can you see that better now? Thank you. I've got somebody keeping me right in the shadows. It's quite unnerving. Right. So you can see that a little bit better now. You can see the Futhark there and the stone and so on. But in this little inscription, it may not be a lot of words, but it tells us quite a lot about what was important to them and what they valued. So I think that's useful. But these are the really very much the only bits that we have that are actually contemporaneous. But the language of the Scandinavian occupation of Scotland was a language called Norn, of Norrena. And it would nowadays be part of the very small family of languages that includes Icelandic and Faroese, what we call West Norse. East Norse is the language group which gives us English, Danish, Swedish, Dutch, Frisian, or what have you. And just move on my slide if I can. Not a moment for the slide to be sticking. Right, I wonder what's happened here. Sorry about this, it seems to have stuck. Okay. Right. There we go. I hope that's changed now. Yes, this is all going terribly well. Right.
That's great. That's fine. That's good. That's great.
Technology is not with me today, I'm afraid. Now,
No
this
worries.
is a piece of Norn. So I'm going to be a long time since this language was heard, and certainly online. So I'm going to read this to you, and I think you'll recognise what it is as I go along. Favar ir I himri, heller ir I nam thita, gea costum thita kumma, beathina motivara gort to jurn sinna gort I himri, gavas down da dalek brovora, forgive us sinnavora, so we forgive syndara mutharis. Leave us me in temptation and deliver us from all ill. And that is, of course, the Lord's Prayer in Norn. So that's the language that they would have spoken. But how does that fit into place names? Okay, now when we're looking for the Norse influence in place names in Scotland, it's easy to think, yes, we can see them in places like Caithness. So let's start with Caithness then, and let's burrow down a little bit. So here are some places, Caithness and a couple of Sutherland ones there. You can see it, Tum, Helmsdale, Brora and Gulsby. So this is how they look today. So what happens if we take these place names away and we put them back to how they used to look? Not so very different, are they? If you look at Thursa there, interestingly enough, people in Thurso pronounce Thurso Thursa. So there's clearly some atavistic remembrance of that. We can see that Wick quite simply is Vic. We can see that Watton quite simply is Vatten. And Dungansby, it gives you Duncansby there as well. And we can see Hjalmansdal, and we'll come back to that one. That's one that I want to talk a little bit about. But a few years ago, when the Gaelic place names were coming to the north of Scotland, the Caithness councillors asked me to come and do a presentation to the Highland Council to explain just how Norse their place names were. And I actually mocked up a road sign with the place names on it, which you can see are very, very similar. So this is not unusual. This is, we'd expect this. We're not surprised by this. We know that this is where we'd expect to find the place names. So let's just have a move on for a moment and have a look at Lewis. Let's go straight to the heart of the Gaeltacht. The place that has the most Gaelic speakers per capita in Scotland is Lewis. And let's have a look at some of their place names. Of the 126 place names in Lewis, 99 are Norse. And here are some of the place name elements. Nis up there at the top that you can see, meaning a headland or a point, which gives you the wonderful tautology, point of Ness. Bak, Borg, which is the fortified area. Vik, which I think is one of the most important elements in the place names in the Western Isles, actually, because it gives you Uig and Eig. And this is quite interesting because the Norse substrate is buried by the spelling in a way. And so, for example, the glamorous village on Skye that's Tarskevig, how romantic that sounds. In Norse, that's Cod Bay, which is less romantic, but it's really accurate. Tarbet, of course, the narrow strip of land. You can see that it's there on the map, just where that big red dot is at the bottom there. That is a narrow strip of land. Actually, in many cases, how the Norse, it was the place where the Norse used to move their boats from one body of water to another. Gia gives you Gyo. Val, of course, is a hill. Kirk is a church. Holm is a small island. Vatten is a lake. I is an island, and Fial is a brae. And they are all there in place names. So we see them there as elements in the Isle of Lewis, and we're going to look at them in a wee bit more detail. Okay. So first of all, we're looking at the patterns of Norse settlement and activity, again from Professor Nicolaison's excellent book. And we can see that the density of Norse place names is very much probably where we'd expect them to be, in their fairly pure form, Orkney, Shetland, and the Western Isles. You can see that as the very dark hatching there. But there's also place names of mixed Gaelic and Norse character, which we can see in Sutherland, down the western seaboard, Lewis, and so on and so forth. And we can also see other place names which are mixed Gaelic, Norse, and Danish character. So there's quite a puzzle to unravel. And I'm going to start with one here, which is Dingwall or Thingwallar. Now, Dingwall is right up in the Highlands, if you like. It's right there in the centre of the Gaeltacht. And this is the fact of the story, that the Gaeltacht, the Gaelic-speaking, is absolutely studded with Norse place names like Afuku, and Dingwall is one of them. It is the place of the Norse thing or parliament. Now, one of the problems that we have with the Norse in the landscape when we have to go looking for them is that they didn't build great constructs, generally speaking. And their thing, their parliament, wasn't a big building of any nature like that. It was an area where people came for what was basically a conflict resolution meeting. They would agree the law and so on, and they would sort out their problems. So, you know, the Norse thing site in Dingwall is actually in the car park of the supermarket, which is rather sad, but there it is. It's there sitting, looking at us from the map that tells us clearly where that is. Dingwall. Let's see what else we can find. Stornoway, lovely Stornoway, Sternberger, the steering bay, completely Norse place name. Let's have a look and see what else we can find. Brodick in Arran there, Brethervik, the Broad Bay, still in the Gaelic heartlands, of course. Colonsay, Colbines Island, there we are, still very much in the Gaeltacht. Hullkirk, slightly off kilter there, that's the High Kirk, that's in Caithness, of course. Malig, what could be more Gaelic than Malig, you might imagine. But we're not entirely sure of the etymology of the first bit. We think it may be Gull, but it's definitely a Vic. It's definitely Gull Bay. Rogart, deep in the Highlands again. Rother Garder, the red enclosure. Ulva. Now, if there's anybody out there the same age as me, you might have learnt the poem Lord Ullin's Daughter at school. Oh, who be ye would cross Loch Gyle, this dark and stormy water? Oh, I'm the chief of Ulva's Isle, and this Lord Ullin's daughter. Well, Ulva means Wolf Island. Could not be more entrenched in the Gaeltacht, and yet sitting there in plain sight is a Norse place name. Sunart as well, the bay there as well, and slate, of course, which means a smooth place, the part of sky down there, slate there. So we have these place names sitting there. But what I want to do now is take us back a little bit through the story and start off with something that's maybe quite obvious that is a Norse place name, and it's Dalar or Dale. And the interesting thing about this is quite it's a younger place name element than the ones that I'm working backwards through the story. So Dalar, a Dalar is a place in many cases where people go and do leisure activities. It's a place when, after the settlement's well settled, it would seem in Scotland at any rate that the Dales, the Dalars, are places where people undertake various leisure activities like hunting, shooting, fishing, that sort of thing, if you like. And we see where they are, and then we can see what we expect here with the Dale names, that the Orkney and Shetland are absolutely covered in them. Plenty in Lewis, plenty in the Inner Hebrides, and down where we'd expect to find them on the coasts there. So let's just nip through a few. Wendale there in Shetland, Helmsdale, Hjalmansdalr, there we are in Sutherland. We saw that earlier in the map of Caithness and Sutherland, where we were replacing the names. Now, Helmsdale, Hjalmansdal, one of the things that I love so much about Norse place names, and there's a lot to like, is that they are either sort of navigational, descriptive, or they're somebody's place. And this is an example of it. Hjalmansdalr or Hjalmansdalr there. So this is a place where Hjalmand came with his friends to shoot and fish and hunt and have a good time. Laxadale, that tells us exactly what was attractive about that place. It was the lax, it was the salmon. And we find a lot of these across the Highlands and Islands because that's what people wanted to know. Where are the salmon rivers? Loch Boisdale, that's another personal place name there. The Loch of Burrisdale there as well. I was just there last week actually. Udal as well, another example. Sadel, notice how the spelling changes as we come further down the coast there. Clydesdale, again, that's a mixture of two things there. And that really refers to the valley of the Clyde. And we can see how the Dale term has been incorporated into that later place name. And of course, Annandale as well, also a river one. So we have the pure example up there in Shetland. We have the examples for the Salmon River. We have the examples for Hjalmansdalr. We have the examples of Clydesdale and Annandale, where it's incorporated into an understanding of the landscape. So what happens? Oh, and Diverdale as well. That's a personal place name one. So what happens? And Grundale. I'll go overexcited, but far too many on there. And Rodal. Now, Rodal is a very interesting one. That's actually in the Isle of Harris, and that's the valley of the Rood. So again, that's an example of taking the Norse place name and adding something of a Christian variety to it, or indeed a Latin variety to give a special place name there. And it's quite interesting how the A sound often changes to an E sound when we're dealing with the Gaelic homelands as well. But I'll come back to that when we look at something else in a moment. Okay, now Bolstadr. If I was ever in love with a place name element, it's this one. It means farm, but it's one of the most oldest and most prevalent Norse place name elements. Bolstadr settlements are important and sizable central farms in fertile areas, indicating early settlement. And the pattern of Bolstadr names on the map is very much the pattern of Norse settlement, as we can see from the map here. These place names appear in many forms, from the Bister, Buster names of Orkney and Shetland, the Stern and Pster names of Caithness, to Bost, Bus, mainly an Islay, e.g. Rissibus, we'll come back to that in a minute, Bol, Pol and Bo, in traditionally Gaelic-speaking areas. And the Gaelic influence on the Norse languages led to the loss of the final syllable and indeed to the substitution of a voiceless for a voiced consonant, i.e. P for B in the case of Ullapool, and indeed the loss of ST and L in several instances. And examples include Harbost, that we can see there, the High Farm, Lurbost, the Muddy Farm, which doesn't sound ideal, Garabost and Shawbost, which is the farm by the sea. But also, let's just go on a tour with this particular place name element. Herbister, as we'd expect up in the Northern Isles. Crabster, the farm of the cormorants. Camster in Caithness as well. But also Rhesibus, down there in Isla, which means the brushwood farm. You see what's happening on this? On the Norse side of things, we're keeping the second part of the place name element. In the Gaelic side of things, we're keeping the first part of the place name element, and the place name element is Bolstad. Right. Ullapool. There we go now. This is a great favourite because nobody expects that to be a Norse name. It's actually Olaf's farm, but they've kept the ball from Bolstadr, but it has gone to that voiceless sound of p. You know how, and as a Highlander myself, I can say this, we tend to have that kind of tutelary way of saying Chessie and Jean and things like that, and aspirating and going for the voiceless sound. That's what's happened with Ullapool. Did you think for a minute anything that looked like Ullapool was actually a Bolstadr place name? Well, it is, and it's not the only one. You've got Erebal right up there on the north coast, just right there on the north coast, known to everybody in my family as Loch Horrible because it's so difficult to drive down the side of. But Erebal is Eric's farm, and here what's happened is they've kept the b, but the o is not a pool, it's a ball. So you can see that they kept the ball from Bolstadr there. It's quite the story because it goes on. Skibo, for example, and Embo in Shetland, just keeping that bow component of the Bolstadr element as a place name. Quite extraordinary. Let's move on to Setter. Let's move back a little bit in the story. Setter is a township or a shieling. And this place name element came to Scotland before the settlement of Iceland, actually, probably in the 9th century. And its distribution maps on to the second wave of Norse settlement, which was extensive. In Orkney and Shetland, it appears as Setter, S-E-T-T-E-R, for example. Our airport here in Kirkle is Grimsetter, so Grim's farm. Grim and Glum were very popular names for boys in the Viking era. We might not perhaps necessarily be adopting them today, but they were. In Orkney and Shetland, then it's Setter, and in the Hebrides, it appears as Shudder, as we can see in these two names here, Geshudder, which is the goat steading or goat shieling, if you like, and Shudder, which is the farm by the sea. Shea Shudder, if you like, is what it would be, or Shea Sitter is what it would be. But they're not alone. We've got Grimshudder there, just the same as Grimsetter here in Orkney, but that's over there in the Western Isles. Shudder, just simply farm, occurs quite frequently. Shudder, the farm of the island. Shudder is there, and Linshudder, which means the flax farm is there. And Brynishudder, which is Drenger's Shudder. So it's a personal name. So we can see that these are very descriptive place names that tell us a story of who lived there and why. Now, the next one I want to have a look at is Stater, meaning dwelling or farm again. And this is one of the very oldest Norse place name elements. It was a popular choice in Norway before the Viking expansion. And the Stader place names, there's roughly 37 in Shetland, 25 in Orkney, and 25 in the Hebrides, usually with a personal name element, give us the earliest indication of Norse settlement patterns in these areas. The element is usually in the form sta in Gaelic, in speaking areas, and sta or storn in Orkney and Shetland. So let's have a look at some of them. Ulster, Rolf's farm. You see again what's happening here. That is the first component of the place name element that is giving us the Gaelic place name, and it's the second component of Ston or Stad and so on that is giving us the place name elements in the northern areas. So that's Tolstavit, and I was actually on that beach last week. Mangersta. Okay, brace yourselves, folks. That's Magnus's farm. My favourite, Mjalista, which is Njal's farm. And the Njal is my son's name, which is why I'm so particularly fond of that one. So we have quite a lot of them there. We also have Scarista, again, the place of the cormorants. Verista, another personal name. Oh, sorry, I'll go back to that. I just want to say something. But there are other things that are buried in this place name information. They tell us about how long people were there, when they came, what kind of dwellings they made, and where they travelled. But I found a wonderful secret, and I think Ian Taylor, the place name expert, also has noted this, that there's a place name on Lewis called Yorapi, and there's Yoradal. And if you drill right down, we're finding this place name is telling us something incredibly important about the Norse and their traditions, because Europe is Joran's form, and Joransdale, and Joran is a woman's name. And that tells us that Joran was a woman of enough importance to have a place name called after her. And it also leads us into knowing a little bit about the society that would allow a woman to have a place name called after her. Women in the Norse age and in the colonies in Scotland and so on were very important. They had much better rights than we had in this country up until the Married Women's Property Act at the end of the 19th century. And they could own property, they could go to the thing, you know, for example, if they didn't like their husband, if he was particularly poor at Viking, for example, they could complain and they would be offered another husband perhaps, or they might be offered their dowry back or whatever it might be. But they had rights, they could travel, they could own property, all of these different things. Women in our era couldn't really travel until the 20th century, which is why, for example, the herring girls were treated with such disdain when they travelled about after the herring fleets, because this was not seen suitable for a woman to do at all. And for example, it's quite interesting, the rape laws in medieval Europe are damage to a man's property. In Norse law, it's a very different matter, and crime of the body and so on. So women had much better rights. And here is the evidence for it, sitting there looking at us on a map. There it is. So we get wonderful evidence of all of these kind of things there as well. We get the evidence for the Norse in place names, but we also get them in the personal names I was referring to earlier and the surnames. But there's another place where we can see them in the landscape. Now that's a thing site, if you like, in Shetland. As you can see, there's nothing there. It is a liminal space between land and sea. So where do we see the Norse every day, not just in the place names? We see them in the shape of our houses. The kind of shape of the very room that you're probably sitting in now is very much due to the Norse settlements, because before that we were living in cloverleaf shaped houses or round houses. So it's in many ways, it's an everyday story of ordinary folk when it comes to the Norse. They sit in the landscape there, looking at us in the place names, waving at us through two layers of language, through the Gaelic versions in most cases and the English versions as well. They wave at us, but yet they are absolutely fundamental to who we are and where we came from. The colour of our hair, the laws that we have, the concept of social democracy in Scotland, all sorts of things. The Norse didn't come in the night, hep to the back teeth and magic mushrooms and rape and pillage and leave. They left. They're here. They are us. Thank you very much. I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Donna. That was a real tour de force, and so interesting. All sorts of new things came out there. That was absolutely splendid. Thank you. Well, we have some Q&As. I'm going to open them up, have a little peek, and see what we've got here. Some of them, right at the start, I just put one in because there's someone here who says hello. One of your former students who attended your lectures, called Fiona Newton, so she just wanted to say that. And here's someone else who wants to say hello. So I think you've got some fans already.
Oh, that's nice. Hello, Fiona. I remember you fine. Yeah.
There you go. And there's Donna from Texas. There we go. So you've moved around. Now here we go. Here's an anonymous attendee who wishes to talk about Magnus Magnusson. So he draws our attention, says that, oh yes, well, everyone thinks it's surely a cliche. Magnusson said they were farmers 42 years ago, and so is, well, everyone. I'm not sure about everyone. Certainly, when my daughter went to one of these places, they offered her a horned helmet to put on so she could have a photograph taken. So people are still doing it.
It's an interesting fact, though, Jeremy, that Magnus Magnusson was so proud of his Norse heritage and loved Orkney so much that he chose to have the last episode of Mastermind, which he delivered from St Magnus Cathedral.
Did he?
Interesting. Yes, he did. And another thing about Magnus, and my own son's name is Niall Magnus, is that Magnus is an incredibly popular name that's had currency even when being Norse wasn't a thing in Scotland. You still have people called Magnus, and it's actually Harold Harold Bluetooth, I think it was, no letters please, I've got that wrong, a king of Norway who may have been Harold Bluetooth, was such a fan of Charlemagne or Carla Magnus that he called his son Magnus. And that's where the name comes into the narrative. And nothing could be more Norse than Magnus, and yet nothing, and it's a name that has tremendous currency. So certainly Magnus Magnusson wrote very extensively about Icelandic things and various aspects of that, but he did have a passionate attachment to Scotland as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a couple of more detailed questions here. Here's someone says, I'm half Norwegian, but raised and lived in Scotland. This is Doreen Berkeland. Berkeland sounds fairly Norse. Almost every year I come across Norwegian words that have direct relation in older Scots words, like in Burns. Has there been any extensive studies into the vocabulary between Scots dialects and Norwegian?
Well, it's funny you should say that. Because here in the Northern Isles, of course, when we have Norwegian visitors, they have very little difficulty in understanding what we are saying. For example, and we are the same, and it's the same for a lot of Scots, because the language Stour, for example, is universal, unfortunately. And that's one of the reasons that I love the fact that the Norwegian word for a hoover is a Stour sukker.
Fantastic.
But yes, we have done quite some research, not only into the words themselves, but also the rising intonation that we have in Orkney, the cadence. I mean, I'm not speaking with an Orkney accent to you now. I'm making every effort to speak Scottish Standard English, but may lapse at any moment. But that right, I'd like a glass of wine, right? For example, that sort of thing. That's very much influenced by East Norwegian dialects, which is really interesting, because if you look at the history and why there's such a volume of words of Norse, pure Norse origin in Orkney and Shetland. Orkney and Shetland, of course, became part of Scotland in what's called the impigneration, which is a very fancy word, one February afternoon in 1472 as part of the dowry of the daughter of Christian of Denmark. And Orkney stayed very much a wealthy backwater part of Scotland, but Shetland moved back and forth and had a lot of liaison with the Hanseatic League. But what they both have is a corpus of words that have not come through Scots, they've come directly from Norse. So we have an awful lot of Norse words that Norwegian friends recognise to do with weather, usually bad weather, unfortunately, although it's definitely lovely here today. Usually bad weather, for example, smoken and smuren, to do with the snow blowing up in the air and all of this sort of thing. So that there's a wealth there. And the term bigging, for example, is something that's very common as a name for a house here. It's very recognisable to Norwegian. So there's a volume of work on it. I did a paper myself on the Norse substrate in Orkney and Shetland dialect, but a number of other colleagues have written far more than me. But if anybody wants to send me an email, and I can give them some details of papers to read.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, the questions are coming thick and fast. Here's another one. Here's someone who's writing from Valencia in Spain. She says, are there any publications about the Norse in Ireland?
Oh yes, I mean there's a volume there, and again that's a really interesting story too. I have a particular theory, and I'm going to sound a klaxon of warning and alert here about red hair, right? This is because I myself produced a gigantic red-haired child, and on his first day of school, I took him to school, and there were 4 other redheads in a class of 20, which is statistically very unusual. So it set me off on a long trail of finding this out, and they have come to the conclusion that although red hair is obviously an early Celtic gene, it may possibly klaxon have become identified with static Norse populations in Ireland, in Scotland, in Russia, in Sicily, and various other places. Now again, klaxon, right? Because there's a lot of work going on to look at the genetics of people in Orkney Shetland, has been going on for a long time. And as I speak now, Professor Jim Flett Wilson is giving a talk on the genetics down the road. So very important. But I did have I did have one delightful thing, which may be the highlight of my academic career so far, is that this particular idea appeared in a Val McDermid novel. And I wrote to her and I said, where did you get that from? She said, I got it from you. You know, I think the story of the Norse in Ireland is a very interesting one. We have the Norse Irish kingdoms. There's a lot of material written on that. And for example, I was talking about the role of women, for example, Aud the Deep-Minded, and a famous character who took her people all over the place looking for a home for them when her husband died and so on. You know, they have that connection with the Norse Irish kingdoms as well. And it's interesting too that if you look at how the genetics divides up, if you like to call them the Norwegian Norse, that's a bit grim term, but that takes in Scotland, Cumbria, and basically Ireland and the top of Wales. And the Swedish, this is, if there's a Viking expert in the audience, they'll be throwing things at the screen, but this is a very big paintbrush, big stroke view of it. But the other side then is very much more the Danish and Swedish.
Fantastic. Shows how, well, your maps were splendid and showed how water's a connector, isn't it? I think that comes across so much, isn't it? Absolutely.
That's a really good point, Jeremy, because this is the thing. People say, oh, how could they control these kingdoms? I mean, the earldom of Orkney was absolutely colossal at one stage under Thorfinn the Mighty, who is described in Orkneyinga Saga as an ugly-looking man with a bad temper, but clearly that's no barrier to power, as we know. But he controlled a kingdom that included Caithness, Sutherland, Orkney, Shetland, you know, various other, and with boats. And that's one thing about the boats, is we know that we can still follow the sailing instructions in the sagas today. We know that they could nip across in no time at all and control these kingdoms. And we see places with sea around it as distant and remote. They saw them as places to live.
Yeah, fantastic. Lots of questions for me, but it's not for me to ask. Here's someone who says, my grandma's from Europe. So that's great to know it's a female place name. So there you go.
Nice. How lovely.
That's nice. Yeah. Here's someone who says, I'm still confused why there is so little knowledge of how the Norse people integrated to Ayrshire.
Well, yes, it's, again, because it doesn't suit the prevailing, you know, origin myth, if you like. I mean, this has been, people think about, if they do think about the Norse at all, they certainly don't think about Dumfries and Galloway or Ayrshire or anywhere like that, when of course they were there.
And
the other thing, so I agree with you, it's a poor do, madam.
Next one is Annie Anderson. And this is very interesting because there's kind of layers of names, isn't it? What about the names that preceded the Norse names? I presume she's talking about Cumbric and things like that.
Oh, yes. Very interesting. I mean, that's a whole discussion in itself, Jeremy, as you know. But here in Orkney, for example, about 96% of the place names in Orkney are Norse. And there are a few other ones that we don't know, and we do. Interestingly enough, the place names that seem to have lasted that are pre-Norse or pre-Celtic or whatever, if you like, are island names, like Unst, Skye, Mull, Fetler, and various other places. We don't know what these names mean. We give them names. You know, we call them. We say that Skye is, we give it a Gaelic translation, and so we don't actually know what it means. So they're pre anything to do with the Norse or indeed the Celts. Really interesting, and they're still there. It's the same. People try to take the name Lewis and make it into something either Norse or Celtic, and I don't think it is either of them. But it's, you know, there's a lot of debate about that. So they just, you see, this is the great debate. Always was. When the Vikings came to Orkney and Shetland, did they tiptoe into a museum? Was there nobody here? Did they kill everybody, or did they, and this will be the facts, folks, make very good use of the people that they found there and marry them, generally speaking, or what have you, particularly what have you, I suspect. But, you know, and again, the place names, it almost seems as if somebody's just taken a cloth over the map and wiped everything that was there before. We know that there were things there before. We know that, for example, for the Romans, Orkney was the end of the Roman Empire, according to them. We also know, of course, that Tacitus tells us that Agricola got as far as what was obviously Thurso, took one look at the Pentland first and says, don't think we'll bother, boys. Let's go back.
Fantastic. So interesting. Well, people have got a bit of spelling stuff here. Here we go. Here's someone. Could you give us the Norse spelling of Europa? Someone wants to know how it looks like when you do it in Norse.
Well, it'd be Jorunn, and it would be it would have the st on the end, I think, but I'm not entirely sure. Stither on the end. I'm not entirely sure, but it's certainly
Stadler.
yes,
Stadler.
yes,
Stadler. Yeah,
yes, but
Stadler. Oh,
yeah.
very good. Very good. Very good. Very
I'm
good.
not entirely sure of that, but certainly the Joran bit is right.
Yeah, yeah. Very
But
good.
it's marvelous because it's all, you know, the sounds have changed. The way it's been
Yeah.
written, then it's gone through the mill, as it were, of, you know, the regulation of Gaelic orthography as well, which, you know, it makes it even more buried there, but it's sitting there looking at you in the map.
It's fantastic. More questions there. They keep coming. Oh, here's a slightly political one. What do you think of the Gallicization place names? Ding. What would you do with Dingwall? You know.
Well, see, they haven't. What they've done is it's not actually even Gaelic, as you know, Jeremy. The pepper.
No, it's Norse.
But Inverpeffer, for example, is the name that's sometimes used for. No, I'm not a massive fan of that, and I can say that as a Gaelic speaker. So no letters, please. Right, but I do find, you know, for example, I'm in a running feud with BBC Alba at the moment over the way that they've translated Kirkwall into Gaelic, because Kirkwall was originally Kirkhegalver, the Bay of the Kirk, then it becomes Kirkvole, pronounced here as Kirkwa. Scots cartographers come in and think, oh, it's a man's a man for all that situation, and put two L's in. So we have Kirkwall, right? However, this seems not to have dawned to the powers that be at BBC Alba, because they've translated it as basically the Kirk, the town of the church. You know, by English, instead Balin English rather than by in English instead. So I'm having a running feud, supported, I would have to say, to his eternal credit, by the Gaelic officer at the University of Highlands and Islands, DJ McIntyre. But so I'm not a fan of enforced. I mean, for example, Wick has been changed into Inner Uig, right? Inver Uig, if you like, but Uig is Wick anyway.
So it's like Bay.
Well, it's not ideal. And then we've got Inner Hursa for Thurso, which no. I think, you know, leave well alone. The one names that I did when I did my mock-up road sign was places like Latherin, which you could give a Norse name for and a Gaelic one quite reasonably as well. But, you know, leave well alone, folks.
Well, there's still more questions. Some of them really interesting. Here's someone from the Basque country, and she says, "What about there's supposed to be a song Basque, as far as I can see. What's it? Since the first lord of the Biscay territory, known as Hon Zuria, the White Lord, supposed song on a Viking princess in exile from Scotland." So there you go. It's yet more movement around. Isn't that interesting?
We get everywhere, Jeremy. We get everywhere. Sicily was a Viking kingdom.
Yes, here we go. It keeps going on. That really interesting. Well, it's like hearing bagpipes in Galicia, isn't it? Which I always seems interesting. Here's a nice one. Do we see any evidence of Norse place names in the New World? Well, they were there.
Yes. Now this is quite
give
interesting
them names.
because yes, there's one example which when they were investigating Lonsdale Meadow in Newfoundland, they found evidence for a place that was called Hup. And this, you know, I was asked amongst many other far more experienced scholars to see what I thought that might be. I said, give me a map and I'll show you where it is. Because a Hup is a bay enclosed within a bay, right? For example, we have here the place name St. Margaret's Hope in Orkney, right? Pronounced by everybody that lives there as simply the Hup, because that's what it is. Right, so my contribution, right, you know, whether it was the right thing or not, was to look at the map and say, "There's your Hup, boys. There it is," because it's a navigational thing. What do you need to know? You need to know where the sheltered bay within a bay is, don't you?
You do indeed.
So there is some modest evidence, although there's many artifacts and things that purport to be of Norse origin in the New World, which I soak my teeth in at.
Yeah, fantastic. Doreen's come back to say a washcloth is a Vaskaklut.
Marvelous. Yes.
Which I
think
is well.
There we go. You can see how all these things hang together.
Yeah. Here's a question. I'm very married. I'm very interested in the comparison you make between Norse and Celts. All the things you say about the Norse, didn't write things down, marginalize others. Even say about the Celts in a broader British context. How come the Celts won over the Norse in Scotland? You know,
Well,
so why is it this Celtic all over Lewis, but not but all the names of Norse?
because of timing, because
Yeah.
the apogee of Norse power was before before the formation of the kingdom of what we call Scotland or Alabar, whatever you like, and also because of the choosing, the active choosing. For example, after Culloden, 1746, of course, not a result, frankly, on the day, right? And after that, 30 years of harrying the North and the trampling of the culture, and then, of course, James Macpherson finds the poems of Ossian, right? And people identify with this, they identify with this Fenian cycle and various other things, and they identify with that Celtic myth. And that's another reason too. And also, as I was saying, because the movers and shakers in Scottish history, not all of them, but some big boys like Bruce and Wallace, they're Southwest boys, they're Celtic boys. I mean, although Wallace's name means Welshman, really, or stranger, but there we go. They're definitely not Norse, unfortunately. So that's the problem.
Yeah, there you go. Well, there's more coming in. Here's an anonymous person, but it does sound this. I'm a complete layman. Phil loved it. Would you please be comfortable sharing a recommendation for a book where I can start to understand more? Are there any good books on this, which would be quite good?
Well, if you're looking for a book on place names, and it's an old favourite, and I'm going to say it's Bill Nicolauson's Scottish Place Names. It's a very accessible text. People have different views maybe on some elements of it now, but it's good solid stuff. So if it's place names you're interested in, it's very, very well written and very easy to read. But what would you think yourself, Jeremy? Is there anything?
Well, I was going to say Nicolauson because the thing about it is such he writes so well, and as we all know, easy reading is hard writing, and he does a lovely job. There are some quite good things like introductions to Scots vocabulary, which are worth looking at. The Concise Scots Dictionary's got quite a nice little introduction, which is worth having a look. Gives you a potted history of things, and there are sort of references you can then follow up from there. But it's a fascinating thing, and of course, the trouble is, of course, you want to keep, as you've demonstrated so beautifully, you can't separate language from culture because they go together, don't they? And all of those things. Here's some more. Doreen's doing, but some stuff about red hair seems to have started a big thing here, which we'll maybe skate over that. And here's the Viking helmet thing. This is where, yes, Polly UK, yes, they're still presented even on some of your maps as the Vikings are wearing those damned helmets, she says. And yes, that's where my daughter was given one when she was little. So there you go. Black Isle from Sheila Curry, which looks good. We have Culbo and Udale. It feels like it's a boundary area in the Black Isle. That's right, isn't it?
That's substantially correct. Yeah.
Yeah. It's sort of it's where you get sort of things going together.
Viking, the Norse boundary, the way they worked out boundaries is another lecture in it. So, but it's really interesting how they demark these, and they do demark them with that kind of thing, that kind of placing.
Yeah. I love it when you get these places which blend up cultures. The famous one is Kirkcudbright, isn't it? The one which has the Norse bit and the Old English name, which is actually a borderland name, and the funny and Celtic element order. Norse and Galloway, like more on this. That actually goes with that, doesn't it? Jenny Blaine asked this. Can you tell me more about Norse and Galloway?
Oh yes, well then the Norse were very influential in Galloway. The clues in the name there. I think you find the Gals, the foreigners. The place of the foreigners, and of course the name for the Inner Hebrides, the Instagal as well. Mighty Somerled with his Norse name there.
Fantastic.
Absolutely. The Norse are very fundamental to the story of Galloway.
They certainly are. You were talking about, you gave a good example of Dingwall, and I came off the motorway the other day going to take some students down to Roughwell and go past Thingwall. There's a Thingwall down there, all over the wretched place, aren't they? Rodel, Here's from GLS, says, I know the church well, but didn't quite catch the explanation of the name.
Or I'm just saying that it's Rood Valley.
Ah, there you go, Rude Valley.
Rudale. So the
Rude as
the
in
Dalar
cross.
would have been a
Yeah.
place that wasn't settled in the same way. So it was a place
Yeah.
apart. So when they come to build the church, they build it there, and they call it Rud,
Yeah.
which is the the old term for a cross. And
Yes.
that's what it is. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And GLS has now told us that actually it's her company name. She's called Bridget Geddes. So nice to hear from you, Bridget. There we go. And here's a nice one about orderings. Would it be the Picts that came before the Norse or the Celts arrived in Scotland? Well, there's a question about Picts. Tell us
Yes,
about
well, the Picts were
Picts,
here before
Donna.
the Norse. Again, Jeremy, that's a whole other basket of stuff.
Yeah.
But yes, the Picts were here before the Norse and the Celts or the Scots as well. If you think of the founding of the Kingdom of Dalriata, for example, the Picts were there, and then within a generation, roughly speaking, it's a slight exaggeration, but not really, they were all subsumed, but they were Pictish kingdom. Orkney was a Pictish kingdom. Or a Pictish hegemony at any rate. So yes, they were. The trouble with them, the poor souls, is we know they had a very complicated society, but because we don't understand their language, they are waving at us from behind the glass. They're speaking, but we cannot hear them. A bit like us earlier on, Jeremy. Right. We can't hear them. We see their symbols, but we don't know what they are. We put our own interpretation on these symbols. Who knows? So they're slightly detached from us in the sense we have bits of place names. For example, Pit is a Pictish place name element. For example, Pit Capel is another example of those the mixed ones in the Pit and place Pit Capel for horse, Celtic, and Pit and Weem and other fabulous places like that, and Navity, and so on and so forth. But they're just there in the place names themselves.
I know. It's fascinating, that, isn't it? It's like when you sort of come across really deep time things, and you kind of wonder, I wonder what Ötzi the Iceman sounded like. The chap who fell in the glacier.
Oh yes.
We just don't know. So I think I do need to finish here, and the questions are still coming in, but I think we'll have to call it a day there, which shows how fantastic it's been. But thank you so much, Donna, for a wonderful talk, and such a learned thing. I've been told that we can, if you have any questions, we can pass them on to Donna to answer at a later date, if you're okay with that.
That's absolutely fine. I'm delighted.
They're going to hang on to all these, and I'm sure it's just the opening up of a conversation rather than closing it off, which is what a lot of these events are very like. But look, thank you so much. Big thank you, Donna, then for that. Thank you very much for the attendees and all the people who put in questions, and even those who just lurked there and enjoyed it. I know it's sometimes a rather strange experience doing this on Zoom. We're all getting used to it a lot more than we used to. But it's, I think, a wonderful way of reaching out. I'm particularly pleased to see all those folk who came from all over, way beyond Scotland. So that was really quite something. We do have more curious events coming up, and if you go to www.rse-curious.com, then if you go to that, www.rse-curious.com, there are more events that are still going on for at least the rest of this week. That would be that's do keep an eye out for some of those.